I was 24 years old the first time a man looked at me as though I were real. It was not a gentle discovery, nor a kind one, but rather the sort of revelation that tears through the quiet fabric of a life lived in shadow and leaves everything afterward impossibly, irrevocably changed. My name is Elspeth Wren, and for 8 years I existed as little more than a ghost in the corridors of Ashworth Hall. I was the girl who carried coal before dawn and scrubbed floors until my knuckles bled. I was the figure in the corner of the kitchen, the shadow slipping through servants' passages, the creature who had learned that survival meant erasure. To be seen was to be vulnerable, and I had been vulnerable once before, in the years after my mother died, when the world taught me with cruel efficiency that orphan girls with nothing to their names must make themselves small or be consumed entirely. Ashworth Hall became my sanctuary and my prison in equal measure. The estate sprawled across the Derbyshire hills like a sleeping giant, its limestone facade weathered by 2 centuries of rain and wind, its windows glinting like watchful eyes in the afternoon sun. I arrived there at 16, clutching a letter of reference so worn from handling that the ink had begun to fade, and I was taken in by the housekeeper, Mrs. Cordelia Blackett, a woman whose severity masked a pragmatic compassion that I would only come to understand years later. "You will work," she told me on that first day, her gray eyes assessing me with the detachment of someone who had seen 100 girls like me pass through these halls. "You will be silent, you will be invisible, and if you are fortunate, you will survive long enough to become useful." I became useful. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move through rooms as though I were made of air, to exist in the spaces between moments where no one thought to look. I learned the rhythms of the great house, the way the floorboards creaked in the east wing, the hour when the cook began preparing supper, the precise temperature at which the Duke preferred his evening tea. I learned everything about Ashworth Hall except how to be a person within it. The Duke himself was a figure of distant terror in those early years. Hadrian Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, was spoken of in whispers among the servants, his name carrying the weight of scandal and tragedy that I only half understood. He had married young, they said, to Lady Rosalind Fairfax, a celebrated beauty whose portrait still hung in the long gallery, her painted eyes following visitors with an expression that seemed to me, even then, to contain more cunning than warmth. The marriage had been a disaster whispered about in drawing rooms across England. Lady Rosalind had been faithless, they said, carrying on affairs with such brazen indiscretion that even the most tolerant members of society had begun to turn away. And then she had died, 3 years before my arrival at Ashworth Hall, in circumstances that the servants discussed only in fragments and half-sentences that fell silent whenever I drew near. I did not understand, in those early years, why the Duke had retreated so completely from the world. I saw him only in glimpses, a tall figure in dark clothing crossing the entrance hall with swift, purposeful strides, or a silhouette in the library window late at night when I crept through the corridors on some errand. He never looked at the servants. He never looked at anyone, as far as I could tell, except perhaps the bottom of his whiskey glass and the pages of his endless books. I was nothing to him, less than nothing. And I told myself that this was as it should be, that the distance between a duke and a housemaid was a chasm so vast that it might as well have been the distance between the earth and the stars. I told myself that I did not wonder about him, that the glimpses I caught of his face, all sharp angles and shadows, and eyes the color of winter storms, did not linger in my mind during the long hours of work. I told myself many things in those years, and most of them were lies. The night that changed everything began with a storm. It was late October, and the weather had turned savage, rain lashing against the windows with such fury that the glass seemed to shudder in its frames. I was in the kitchen, helping to prepare the evening meal, when Mrs. Blackett appeared in the doorway with an expression that made my stomach clench with apprehension. "Elspeth," she said, and the use of my Christian name, so rare from her lips, told me that something unusual was afoot. Agnes has taken ill. A fever. She cannot attend to the Duke this evening, and there is no one else available. You will bring his supper to the library and see to anything he requires. I felt the blood drain from my face. Agnes Whitmore was the parlor maid who attended to the Duke's personal needs, a position of tremendous responsibility and one that I had never aspired to hold. The thought of entering his presence, of being seen by those cold gray eyes, made my hands tremble so violently that I had to press them against my apron to still them. "Mrs. Blackett," I began, but she silenced me with a look. "You will not embarrass this household," she said, her voice carrying the iron certainty that I had learned never to challenge. "You will conduct yourself with dignity and discretion. You will speak only when spoken to. And you will not, under any circumstances, spill anything." I nodded, my throat too tight for words, and she turned and left me standing there with the weight of the evening pressing down upon my shoulders like a physical burden. The library at Ashworth Hall was a cathedral of books, a vast chamber with ceilings that soared toward shadows and shelves that climbed the walls like wooden cliffs. I had cleaned this room 100 times, dusting the leather spines and polishing the mahogany tables, but always in the early morning hours when the Duke was elsewhere. I had never entered it while he was present, and as I approached the heavy oak doors with his supper tray balanced carefully in my hands, I felt as though I were approaching the lair of some magnificent and dangerous creature. The doors were slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see the warm glow of firelight and the flicker of candles. I paused, gathering what little courage I possessed, and then I pushed the door open with my shoulder and stepped inside. He was seated at the great desk near the windows, his back to me, his dark head bent over a sheaf of papers. For a moment he did not acknowledge my presence, and I stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to announce myself or to simply retreat and pretend that this entire errand had never happened. But then he spoke, and his voice, low and rough and unexpectedly resonant, rooted me to the spot. "You are not Agnes," he said, without turning around. His tone was not angry, merely observant, as though he were noting a change in the weather. "No, Your Grace," I managed, and I was grateful that my voice emerged steady despite the frantic pounding of my heart. "Agnes has taken ill. I am Elspeth. I have brought your supper." A long pause followed, during which I became acutely aware of every sound in the room, the crackle of the fire, the distant moan of the wind, the soft tap of rain against the windows. And then he turned. I had seen the Duke's face before, of course, in those fleeting glimpses across crowded hallways, but I had never been the object of his direct attention, and the experience was nothing like I had imagined. He was handsome, certainly, in the way that a storm or a blade is beautiful, all sharp lines and contained intensity. His eyes were gray, as I had noted before, but up close they held depths that I had not anticipated, shadows and flickers that suggested a mind constantly in motion. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like a man who had forgotten, or perhaps ceased to care, about appearances. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze moving over my face with an attention that made my skin prickle with awareness. I felt suddenly conscious of everything about myself, the plainness of my features, the roughness of my hands, the way my cap sat slightly askew after the exertions of the day. "Elspeth," he repeated, and my name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before, weighted with something I could not identify. "I have not seen you before." "I work in the kitchens, Your Grace," I said, "and I assist with the cleaning. I am rarely in the main house during the evening hours." He nodded slowly, as though this information required careful consideration, and then he gestured toward the small table near the fire where Agnes typically placed his meals. "You may set it there." I crossed the room on legs that felt unsteady, hyper-aware of the distance between us, of the way his eyes followed my movements. The tray was heavy, laden with silver covers and fine china, and I focused all my attention on keeping it level, on not stumbling over the edge of the rug, on not making a complete fool of myself in front of this man who had, until tonight, existed only as a distant legend. I did not see the book on the floor until it was too late. My foot caught the edge of the leather volume, and the world tilted sickeningly. The tray lurched in my hands, and though I fought to steady it, I felt the weight shift beyond my control. The wine decanter slid, toppled, and poured its contents in a crimson flood across the papers on the Duke's desk. For a frozen instant, I could only stare at the spreading stain, at the documents now saturated with claret, at the absolute ruin I had just wrought upon what were undoubtedly important correspondences. The horror that swept through me was physical, a cold wave that left me trembling and nauseous. This was the end, I thought. This was how my position at Ashworth Hall would conclude, in disgrace and dismissal, cast out into the world with nothing to my name but the memory of my own clumsiness. "I am sorry," I gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "I am so terribly sorry, Your Grace." I did not see the book. I should have been more careful. I will clean it at once. I will do anything. I was reaching for the sodden papers even as I spoke, desperate to undo what could not be undone, when his hand closed around my wrist. The contact shocked me into stillness. I had never been touched by a man, not like this, not with intention, and the warmth of his fingers against my skin sent a jolt through my entire body that I did not understand. I looked up, expecting fury, expecting the cold dismissal that I deserved, and instead I found him watching me with an expression that I could not decipher. "Stop," he said, and though the word was quiet, it carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You will only make it worse." "I am sorry," I said again, and to my horror, I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "Please, Your Grace, I will accept whatever punishment you deem fit. I only ask that you not dismiss me. I have nowhere else to go." He released my wrist, and the absence of his touch left me feeling strangely bereft. He straightened, looking down at the ruined papers with a slight frown, and then, to my utter astonishment, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face in ways I had not thought possible. The severity softened, the shadows retreated, and for an instant I glimpsed the man he might have been before the world had wounded him. "These were letters from my solicitor," he said, lifting one of the dripping pages and regarding it with what appeared to be genuine amusement. They contained no information I did not already possess, and several pointed suggestions that I found tedious in the extreme. "You have done me a favor, in fact, by rendering them illegible." I stared at him, uncertain whether this was some elaborate form of mockery or whether the Duke of Ashworth had simply gone mad. "I do not understand, Your Grace," I said. He set the letter down and turned to face me fully, and there was something in his expression now, a curiosity, a sharpness of attention, that made me feel as though I were being examined under a magnifying glass. "You are frightened of me," he observed. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, uncertain how to explain the vast gulf that separated us, the impossibility of a creature like me standing in a room like this with a man like him. "Because you are the Duke," I said finally, "and I am nothing." Something flickered in his gray eyes, something that might have been surprise or might have been displeasure. He was silent for a long moment, and then he walked past me to the windows, where the storm continued its assault against the glass. "I have been called many things," he said, his back to me. "Proud, cold, unfeeling. Some have suggested that I am mad, driven so by the circumstances of my marriage and my wife's spectacular death." His voice was dry, almost ironic. but I do not believe anyone has ever stood in this room and called themselves nothing in comparison to me. It is a novel experience. I did not know what to say to this, so I remained silent, watching the line of his shoulders, the way the firelight played across the dark fabric of his coat. "What is your family name, Elspeth?" he asked without turning. "Wren, Your Grace. Wren." He seemed to consider this. A small bird, unremarkable, easily overlooked. He did turn then, and his eyes met mine across the length of the room. "Is that what you are? A small bird content to hide in the shadows? I have found, Your Grace, that hiding in shadows is an effective way to survive." "Survive," he repeated, and the word seemed to pain him somehow. "Yes, I suppose it is." He paused, then gestured toward the ruined papers on his desk. "You may go. I will not dismiss you for this accident. It was, as I said, no great loss. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to curtsy and flee, to return to the safety of the kitchen and pretend that this strange, unsettling conversation had never occurred. But something held me in place, some reckless impulse that I had not known I possessed. "May I ask, Your Grace," I heard myself say, "why you spend so many nights alone in this room?" The question hung in the air between us, impossibly impertinent, the kind of inquiry that could see me dismissed regardless of his earlier clemency. I watched the surprise register on his face, followed by something else, something that might have been appreciation. "Because books do not lie," he said after a pause. "Books do not scheme or betray or whisper behind one's back at parties. Books ask only that you open them, and in return they offer you worlds far better than this one." I thought of my own illiteracy, the shame of it, the way I had always hurried past the library doors as though the books themselves might somehow detect my inadequacy. "That sounds lonely, Your Grace," I said softly. He smiled again, that same slight quirk of his lips, but this time there was a sadness in it that made my chest ache. "It is," he admitted, "but loneliness is safer than the alternative." I did not know what to say to this confession, so naked in its honesty, so unexpected from a man of his position. I simply nodded, understanding in a way that I could not articulate that we were two solitary creatures who had somehow, in this candlelit room with the storm raging outside, recognized something of ourselves in each other. "Good night, Your Grace," I said, and I turned and left the library, my heart pounding with an emotion I could not name. That night, as I lay on my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the wind howl against the eaves, I replayed every moment of the encounter in my mind. The way he had looked at me, the warmth of his hand on my wrist, the unexpected kindness in his voice when he had spoken of loneliness. I told myself that it meant nothing, that he would forget my existence by morning, that I was a fool to lie awake thinking of a man so far above my station that he might as well have been a constellation. But something had shifted in the universe that night. Some invisible thread had been woven between us, and though I did not yet understand its significance, I felt its presence like a second heartbeat in my chest. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my invisible existence, to the comfortable anonymity of coal and scrub brushes and pre-dawn labors. But it was as though the Duke had opened a door that could not be closed, and now I found myself seeing things I had never noticed before. The way the morning light fell through the high windows of the entrance hall, the scent of beeswax and old paper that permeated the corridors, the beauty of the estate itself, which I had never allowed myself to appreciate because appreciation required presence, and presence was dangerous. I also found myself, despite every effort to the contrary, noticing the Duke. He was everywhere now. Or perhaps he had always been everywhere, and I had simply trained myself not to see. I saw him crossing the grounds in the early morning, his breath misting in the cold air as he walked toward the stables. I saw him in the dining room, eating alone at a table meant for 20, the candlelight casting long shadows across his angular face. I saw him in the library, always in the library, surrounded by his beloved books, seeking in their pages the companionship that the living world had denied him. And sometimes, though I told myself it was imagination, I thought I saw him looking at me. It was a fortnight after the storm when Mrs. Blackett summoned me to her sitting room with an expression that I had learned to associate with momentous news. "The Duke has made a request," she said, and there was a note of bewilderment in her voice that I had never heard before. "He wishes you to attend him in the library each evening. He says," she paused and consulted a slip of paper in her hand, "that you possess a quality of honesty that he finds refreshing, and he wishes to have someone bring his supper who will not flinch every time he speaks." I stood frozen, unable to process what she was saying. The Duke, who had spent 3 years avoiding human contact, who was rumored to have dismissed 2 valets for the crime of excessive conversation, wanted me to attend him regularly. It made no sense. "I do not understand," I said, echoing my own words from that fateful night. "Why would he request me specifically?" Mrs. Blackett regarded me with sharp eyes. I could not say. "But it is not your place or mine to question the wishes of the Duke. You will begin this evening. And Elspeth," she added as I turned to leave, "remember what you are. Do not presume to imagine that this arrangement means anything beyond what it is." I nodded, chastened, and returned to my duties with a mind in turmoil. That evening, I approached the library with the supper tray balanced carefully in my hands and a heart that threatened to beat its way out of my chest. I had taken extra care with my appearance, smoothing my hair beneath my cap, ensuring that my apron was spotless, though I could not have said why these details suddenly mattered to me. The Duke was waiting for me, not at his desk this time, but in one of the leather chairs near the fire. A book lay open in his lap, but he was not reading it. He was watching the door, and when I entered, something in his expression eased, as though my arrival had answered a question he had not known he was asking. "Elspeth," he said, and again, my name in his voice did something strange to my equilibrium. "I was afraid you might refuse." "I could not refuse, Your Grace," I said as I set the tray on the table. "Mrs. Blackett delivered your request as an instruction." He frowned at this. It was not meant as an instruction. It was meant as an invitation. I looked at him then, really looked, and I saw for the first time how tired he seemed, how the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and relentless thoughts. He was a man haunted, I realized, not by ghosts, but by memories, by the weight of a reputation he had not earned and a betrayal he had not deserved. "Then I accept your invitation, Your Grace," I said softly, "though I confess I do not understand why you would extend it." He was silent for a moment, his gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me want to look away and simultaneously made looking away impossible. "Because you called yourself nothing," he said finally. "And I have spent 3 years surrounded by people who believe themselves to be everything. I find that your perspective is a welcome change." I did not know what to say to this, so I busied myself with arranging his supper, laying out the plates and silverware with hands that trembled only slightly. "Will you sit with me?" he asked, "just for a moment. There is a chair by the fire. You must be cold from the corridors." "I should not, Your Grace," I said, even as something within me yearned to accept. "It would not be proper." Proper. The word seemed to amuse him. "I have been accused of many things, Miss Wren, but adherence to propriety has never been among them. Please, sit." And so I sat. It became our ritual in the days and weeks that followed. I would bring his supper each evening, and instead of leaving immediately as any other servant would, I would sit with him by the fire while he ate. At first our conversations were tentative. Small exchanges about the weather, the books on his shelves, the habits of the household. But gradually, as the autumn deepened into winter and the evenings grew longer and darker, the walls between us began to crumble. I learned the rhythms of his moods, the way his brow furrowed when he was troubled, the slight softening around his eyes when something amused him, the restless energy that overtook him on nights when the ghosts of his past pressed too close. I learned that he preferred his tea without sugar but with a splash of cream, that he hated the smell of roses because they reminded him of Rosalind's perfume, that he read poetry when he was melancholy and philosophy when he needed to think. I learned 1,000 small details about him, storing each one away like a treasure, building a portrait of the man behind the title that grew richer and more complex with every passing day. And he, in turn, learned about me. He asked questions that no one had ever thought to ask before, questions about my childhood, my mother, my earliest memories. He wanted to know what foods I liked and what music made me happy, what I dreamed about at night and what I feared most in the world. At first, I struggled to answer. So unused was I to being the subject of anyone's curiosity. But his interest was genuine, his attention unwavering, and gradually I found myself opening to him like a flower turning toward the sun. I told him about my mother, Marjorie, who had loved me fiercely despite the hardships we faced. I told him about the small cottage where we had lived when I was young, before circumstances forced us into service, and the garden where she had taught me to recognize herbs and flowers. I told him about the fever that took her when I was 16, about the terror of finding myself alone in the world, about the kindness of a vicar's wife who had helped me secure a position at Ashworth Hall. I told him things I had never told anyone, secrets I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten they existed. He listened to it all with a gravity that made me feel, for the first time in my life, that my story mattered, that I mattered. One evening, as the fire burned low and the candles guttered in their holders, he reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "Do you know that?" "I am nothing of the kind," I protested, feeling the familiar reflex of self-deprecation rise within me. "I am ordinary. Less than ordinary. No." His grip tightened, and there was an intensity in his voice that made my heart race. "You have survived things that would have broken lesser people. You have maintained your kindness, your honesty, your essential goodness despite a world that has given you every reason to become bitter and hard. That is not ordinary, Elspeth. That is extraordinary." I did not know what to say. No one had ever spoken to me like this, had ever looked at me with such admiration and respect. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes and blinked them back, unwilling to show such weakness before him. "I only did what I had to do," I said finally. "There was no other choice." "There is always a choice," he replied. "You could have become cruel. You could have turned your suffering outward, inflicting it on others, as so many in your position have done. Instead, you chose gentleness. You chose hope. That is a choice, Elspeth, and it is one that speaks to the quality of your character." The conversation lingered in my mind for days afterward, reshaping the way I thought about myself and my history. I had always viewed my past as something to be endured and forgotten, a series of misfortunes that had no meaning beyond their immediate pain. But Hadrian saw it differently. He saw my struggles as evidence of strength, my survival as proof of resilience. And slowly, reluctantly, I began to see myself through his eyes. He told me about his childhood, about growing up in this great house with parents who had been cold and distant, more concerned with duty than with affection. He told me about his brother, Edmund, who had died of a fever at 15, leaving Hadrian as the sole heir to the dukedom and all its burdens. He told me about his years at Oxford, where he had loved poetry and philosophy and had harbored secret dreams of becoming a scholar rather than a duke. And he told me about Rosalind. Her name fell from his lips one night like a stone dropping into still water, and I saw the ripples of old pain spread across his features. They had been married at 21, he said, an arrangement orchestrated by their families, a merger of estates and bloodlines that had nothing to do with love. I was young, he said, staring into the fire as though the flames held some key to understanding. I believed that I could make her happy. I believed that if I was kind enough, attentive enough, devoted enough, she would eventually come to love me as I hoped to love her. But she had not loved him. She had not even tried to love him. From the very first month of their marriage, she had made it clear that she found him disappointing, tedious, beneath her considerable ambitions. She wanted passion, he continued, his voice flat with the effort of containing old emotion. She wanted excitement, adventure, the thrill of the forbidden. I was none of those things. I was a quiet man who preferred books to ballrooms, conversation to conquest. I bored her. He had tried, in those early years, to make her happy. He had bought her jewels and gowns, had taken her to London for the season, had given her everything that money and position could provide. But she had not wanted things. She had wanted passion, excitement, the thrill of the forbidden. She found it in the arms of other men, he said, his voice hollow. First there was a young officer whose regiment was stationed nearby, a Captain William Hartley with a reputation for charm and a complete absence of honor. Then a poet she met at a salon, some tortured soul who convinced her that their connection was transcendent. Then a succession of others whose names I eventually stopped learning. And I, in my pride and my humiliation, chose to look the other way. "Why did you not divorce her?" I asked softly. "Surely you had grounds." He laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Grounds? Yes, I had grounds enough to satisfy any court in England. But divorce would have meant scandal, exposure, the dragging of the Blackwood name through the mud of public scrutiny. My father had only recently died when Rosalind's infidelities became impossible to ignore. I could not bear to heap such shame upon his memory, to tarnish everything he had worked to build. So you suffered in silence, I said, beginning to understand the depth of his isolation, the reason for the walls he had built around himself. I suffered, he agreed, and I waited, though I knew not for what. Perhaps I hoped she would tire of her diversions and return to some semblance of marital duty. Perhaps I hoped she would run away with one of her lovers and spare me the necessity of decision. Perhaps I simply lacked the courage to act. I listened in silence, my heart aching for the young man he had been, so earnest in his attempts to honor a vow that his wife had never intended to keep. She died in a carriage accident, he continued, returning from an assignation at a country inn. Her lover was with her, the poet as it happened, a man named Julian Percival, whose verses she claimed to adore. They were both killed instantly when the horses spooked and the carriage went over an embankment. And within a week the whole of London knew every sordid detail, because the innkeeper recognized her and sold the story to anyone willing to pay for it. I was pitied, of course, which was almost worse than being scorned. Poor Duke of Ashworth, trapped in a loveless marriage with a faithless wife. How tragic that he only discovered the extent of her betrayals after her death. "It was not your fault," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "Her choices were not your failing." He looked at me then, and there was something in his expression that I had never seen before, a vulnerability that made him seem younger, more human, more reachable. "You are the first person to say that to me without qualification," he said. "Everyone else has found a way to suggest that if I had been a better husband, a more attentive lover, a less bookish recluse, she might have been faithful. Those people are fools," I said, and then I felt the blood rush to my face at my own presumption. "I apologize, Your Grace. I should not have spoken so freely." "No," he said, and there was warmth in his voice now, a heat that made something flutter in my chest. "Please do not apologize. Your frankness is the most valuable thing you offer me. It is the reason I requested your company." I looked down at my hands, rough and reddened from years of labor, so different from the soft white hands of the ladies he must have known. "I am glad that my company brings you some comfort, Your Grace," I said quietly, "though I fear I am poor substitute for the society you deserve." "You underestimate yourself," he said, "or perhaps you have never been given reason to do otherwise." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, weighted with something I did not recognize. May I ask you something personal, Elspeth? Of course, Your Grace. Have you ever been courted? Have you ever been in love? The question surprised me, and I felt the color rise again in my cheeks. I thought of the few young men who had passed through the servants' hall over the years, the footmen and grooms who had occasionally cast glances my way. None of them had ever pursued me with any seriousness, and I had never encouraged their attention. I had been too focused on survival, too determined to remain invisible, to allow myself the luxury of romantic attachment. No, Your Grace, I admitted. I have never been courted, and I have never been in love. He absorbed this information with a slight nod, as though it confirmed something he had already suspected. And have you ever been kissed? The intimacy of the question stole my breath. I should have been offended, I knew. A proper lady would have been scandalized by such an inquiry. But I was not a proper lady, and the Duke was not asking out of impropriety. There was genuine curiosity in his voice, a desire to understand, and I found that I could not lie to him. No, I whispered, and the confession felt like stripping away the last of my armor. I have never been kissed. He rose from his chair then, and for a moment I thought he would dismiss me, would retreat behind the walls of propriety that should have governed our interactions from the start. But instead, he crossed the distance between us and stood before me, close enough that I could see the flicker of firelight reflected in his gray eyes. Would you like to be? The question hung in the air, shimmering with possibility and danger. I knew what I should say. I should refuse, should remind him of the chasm between our stations, should flee this room before we both did something that could not be undone. But my heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. And when I looked up at him, at this man who had been wounded by the world just as I had, I found that I could not make myself say no. Yes, I breathed. He smiled then, not the small, sad smile I had seen before, but something fuller, warmer, a smile that transformed his austere features into something almost boyish. Then let me teach you, he said, and he kissed me. It was soft at first, gentle, a question rather than a demand. His lips brushed against mine with a tenderness that made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. No one had ever touched me with such care, as though I were something precious, something worthy of protection. I felt his hand rise to cup my cheek, felt the warmth of his palm against my skin, and I leaned into him without thought, without reservation, surrendering to a sensation I had never dared to imagine. When he deepened the kiss, I gasped against his mouth, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it, by the taste of him, by the way his other arm came around my waist to draw me closer. I was inexperienced, clumsy, uncertain what to do with my hands or my body, but he guided me with patience and tenderness, teaching me the language of desire, one gentle lesson at a time. When at last he pulled away, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting together in the fire-lit darkness. Elspeth, he murmured, and my name had never sounded so beautiful. What have you done to me? I do not know, I admitted, but I fear you have done the same to me. He laughed softly, a sound I had never heard from him before, and the joy in it made my heart soar. I should let you go, he said. It is late, and Mrs. Blackett will wonder where you are. Yes, I agreed, though every fiber of my being rebelled against the thought of leaving this room, this moment, this man. But as I moved toward the door, he caught my hand and pressed a kiss to my fingers. Tomorrow evening, he said, and every evening after that. Will you come to me? Yes, I promised. I will come. And so began the strangest, most wonderful chapter of my life. Each evening I would bring his supper to the library, and each evening we would talk, sitting close together by the fire as the winter winds howled outside. He gave me books, simple ones at first, primers meant for children, and he taught me to read with a patience that never faltered, even when I stumbled over the simplest words. The letters that had always seemed like inscrutable symbols began to resolve themselves into meaning, and I found myself devouring everything I could find, hungry for knowledge that I had never known I craved. The reading lessons became a kind of intimacy, all their own. We would sit together on the velvet settee near the fire, his shoulder pressed against mine as he guided my finger across the page. His voice was low and patient as he sounded out difficult words, and sometimes, when I succeeded in reading a particularly challenging passage, he would smile at me with such pride that I felt I could accomplish anything. "I have never taught anyone to read before," he confessed one evening, after I had successfully navigated my way through an entire chapter of Robinson Crusoe. "It is surprisingly gratifying." "You are a good teacher," I told him, patient and encouraging. "I have a good student," he countered. "Most people would have given up long ago. The primers I started you on are meant for young children. A lesser person would have found them humiliating." I shook my head, unable to explain to him how precious this gift was to me. For years I had avoided the library, had hurried past bookshops and newspaper stands, had hidden my illiteracy like a shameful secret. To be given access to the world of words felt like being handed the key to a prison I had not even known I was locked inside. "My mother tried to teach me," I admitted quietly, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "When I was small. She had learned to read as a lady's maid, and she wanted the same for me. But there was never enough time, and after she died there was no one else who cared enough to try." Hadrian was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender that it made my breath catch. "I care," he said simply, "and you will learn. We have all the time in the world." But it was not only reading that he taught me. On nights when the household slept and the corridors were dark and silent, he would take me in his arms and show me the geography of desire. He kissed me in the shadows of the library, his hands tangled in my hair, my back pressed against the leather spines of his beloved books. He kissed my neck, my collarbone, the hollow of my throat, murmuring endearments against my skin that made me tremble with sensations I had no words to describe. I learned the planes of his face in darkness, the sharp line of his jaw, the unexpected softness of his mouth, the way his breath caught when I dared to touch him in return. We did not consummate our passion, not then. He was insistent on this point, adamant that he would not take from me something so precious without offering something equally valuable in return. But we existed on the knife's edge of propriety, exploring each other's boundaries with a combination of restraint and recklessness that left us both breathless and aching. I knew, of course, that it could not last. I knew that I was playing a dangerous game, that I was risking everything I had built on the altar of an impossible love. But when Hadrian looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, when he spoke my name as though it were a prayer, I found that I could not bring myself to care about consequences. For the first time in my life, I was seen. For the first time, I was wanted, and I would have sacrificed far more than my position for the privilege of that feeling. The winter deepened, and with it, my love for the Duke of Ashworth grew until it consumed every corner of my heart. I no longer recognized myself, this woman who laughed at his jokes and argued with his opinions and fell asleep each night dreaming of his touch. I had been transformed, remade in the crucible of his attention, and I knew with a certainty that frightened me that I would never be able to go back to the shadow creature I had been before. But even as my happiness reached heights I had never imagined possible, the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Lady Venetia Ashworth arrived at the estate on the first day of February, her carriage sweeping up the drive like a harbinger of doom. I had heard of her, of course. Everyone in the household had. She was the Duke's great-aunt, the younger sister of his grandfather, a formidable dowager who had outlived 2 husbands and countless scandals, with her reputation not only intact but enhanced. It was said that she had single-handedly destroyed the prospects of 3 young ladies who had displeased her and had engineered the downfall of a cabinet minister who had once slighted her at a garden party. She was the guardian of the Blackwood name, the keeper of its secrets, and the enforcer of its standards. And her arrival at Ashworth Hall was understood by everyone to be an occasion of the utmost gravity. The household had been in an uproar since the messenger arrived the day before, announcing her imminent visit. Mrs. Blackett had mobilized every servant in the house, ordering a deep cleaning of the guest chambers, a polishing of silver that had not been touched in years, and the preparation of menus that would satisfy even Lady Venetia's legendary discernment. I had been kept busy from dawn until well after dark, scrubbing and polishing and carrying and lifting until my muscles ached and my eyes burned with exhaustion. But even as I worked, I felt a cold premonition settling in my bones. Lady Venetia was not coming to Ashworth Hall for a social visit. She was coming because she had heard something, sensed something, caught wind of some change in her nephew's behavior that had aroused her suspicion. And I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that I was the reason for her sudden appearance. I watched from the window of the upstairs corridor as she descended from the carriage, a tall, angular woman in unrelieved black, her face set in lines of permanent disapproval. Her dress was impeccable, the sort of understated elegance that speaks of old money and absolute confidence. Her silver hair was pulled back severely from a face that might once have been handsome, but had hardened over the years into something cold and calculating. Even from a distance, I could see the steel in her bearing, the absolute certainty of her own authority. This was a woman who had never been questioned, never been challenged, never been denied anything she wanted. Behind her came a lady's maid carrying a small jewel case, and behind her a footman struggling with an enormous trunk. Lady Venetia did not wait for assistance, but swept toward the front door with the imperious confidence of one who expects the world to arrange itself according to her desires. And I knew, with a cold certainty that settled in my stomach like a stone, that she would destroy everything Hadrian and I had built together. That evening, I approached the library with a sense of dread that I could not shake. Lady Venetia had taken supper with the Duke in the formal dining room, an event that had required the mobilization of the entire household staff, and had left Mrs. Blackett in a state of barely controlled anxiety. I did not know what had been discussed during that meal, but as I entered the library with the Duke's evening tea, I saw immediately that something was wrong. Hadrian was standing at the window, his back to the room, his posture rigid with tension. He did not turn when I entered, did not greet me with the warm smile that had become as essential to my happiness as air or water. He simply stood there, a silhouette against the darkness, and when at last he spoke, his voice was flat and distant. "Lady Venetia has come to discuss my future," he said. "She believes it is time for me to remarry." The words struck me like a physical blow. I set down the tea tray with hands that had suddenly lost all steadiness and tried to compose my features into an expression of serene acceptance. "That is to be expected, Your Grace," I heard myself say. "A man of your position—" "I will speak to him," I said, clinging to the last shreds of my dignity. "I will tell him the truth. He will know that I am innocent." Lady Venetia laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "By all means try. But ask yourself this, girl. When faced with a choice between believing his great-aunt, a woman who has protected the Blackwood name for 60 years, and believing a servant he has known for a few months, which do you think he will choose? Love is a pleasant fiction, but blood is forever." She rang a small bell on the table beside her, and a moment later 2 footmen appeared in the doorway. "Take Miss Wren to her quarters," Lady Venetia instructed. "She is to remain there until the Duke has been informed of the situation and has rendered his judgment." The footmen approached me, their expressions uncomfortable but resolved. I could have fought them, could have screamed and protested, and made a scene that the entire household would remember. But something in Lady Venetia's smug certainty told me that such behavior would only confirm her narrative. A guilty woman would panic. A guilty woman would struggle. An innocent woman would wait for justice. I allowed myself to be escorted to my small room at the top of the house, and there I sat on my narrow bed and waited for my world to end. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door, heard whispered conversations that fell silent as soon as anyone noticed my proximity. I imagined Hadrian in the library, confronted with the evidence of my supposed crimes, his face hardening as he realized how foolish he had been to trust a servant with his heart. I imagined him turning away from me, erasing me from his thoughts as completely as Lady Venetia erased undesirable names from her social register. But when the door finally opened, it was not the footman who entered. It was Hadrian himself. He looked terrible. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, his cravat loosened as though he had been pulling at it in agitation. But his eyes, when they met mine, were not cold. They were not distant. They were filled with a fury so intense that it took my breath away. "I did not do it," I said before he could speak. "I know what Lady Venetia told you, but it is not true. I did not steal anything. I would never." "I know," he said, and the words stopped my frantic defense mid-sentence. "Of course I know. Do you think me such a fool that I cannot recognize my aunt's machinations when they are placed before me?" The relief that flooded through me was so overwhelming that I could barely stand. I swayed on my feet, and he crossed the room in an instant, catching me in his arms and holding me against his chest. "I know you," he murmured into my hair. "I know your heart. There is not a dishonest bone in your body, Elspeth. Whatever evidence my aunt has fabricated, whatever lies she has told, they cannot change what I know to be true." I clung to him, trembling with the aftermath of fear and the sudden dizzying return of hope. "She will not stop," I said. "She is determined to destroy me, to separate us. Let her try." His voice was fierce, implacable. "I have already sent for the magistrate. When he arrives, I will demand a full investigation. The evidence will be examined, the chain of custody questioned, and when it becomes clear that the jewelry was planted rather than stolen, my aunt will have some explaining to do." I pulled back to look at his face, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that his confidence might falter. "And if the investigation is not conclusive," I asked, "if she has covered her tracks too well?" "Then I will marry you anyway," he said simply. "I will marry you and let society think what they will. I would rather be a pariah with you by my side than a respected duke alone in this empty house." The words shattered something inside me, some last barrier I had not even known I was maintaining. I began to cry, great heaving sobs that racked my entire body, and he held me through all of it, murmuring endearments and promises and the name he had given me, the name that meant home and safety and love. When at last my tears subsided, he led me to the window and we stood together looking out at the winter landscape, the bare trees and frozen ground and pale gray sky. "There is something else," he said quietly, "something that emerged during my conversation with Lady Venetia. Something about your past." I looked up at him, confused. "My past?" "She had you investigated. She was hoping to find some scandal, some shame that she could use against you. Instead, she found something rather different." My heart began to race again, though this time it was not fear that drove it, but a strange, unfamiliar hope. "My mother was called Marjorie Wren," I said slowly. "She was a lady's maid in service to a noble family. She died when I was 16, and I never knew my father." Hadrian nodded. "According to my aunt's inquiries, your mother was indeed a lady's maid. Specifically, she was in service to the Countess of Bromley. And your father." He hesitated, and I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. "Your father was a gentleman named Theodore Ashford," he continued. "The younger son of a baron who fell in love with your mother and proposed marriage despite the difference in their stations. They were engaged in secret, intending to elope, but Theodore was killed in a hunting accident before they could marry. Your mother, already carrying you, was cast out by the Countess when her condition became known. She never told anyone who your father was, fearing retribution against you." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. My father had been a gentleman. My parents had been in love. They had intended to marry. This changes nothing of substance, Hadrian said gently. You are still born out of wedlock. You are still, by the cruel standards of society, illegitimate. But you are not the nothing you have always believed yourself to be, Elspeth. You are the daughter of a man who loved your mother enough to defy his family, just as I intend to defy mine. The tears came again, but this time they were different. These were tears of healing, of the slow mending of a wound I had carried for so long that I had forgotten it was there. I had always believed myself to be the unwanted product of some sordid encounter, a burden my mother had been forced to bear. To learn instead that I was the child of love, of commitment, of a romance not unlike my own. It felt like being reborn. The investigation proceeded exactly as Hadrian had predicted. The magistrate, a thorough and impartial man named Sir Bartholomew Crane, examined the evidence with meticulous care. He questioned the servants who had supposedly discovered the jewelry in my quarters. He traced the chain of custody of the items themselves, and he discovered, to no one's surprise except perhaps Lady Venetia's, that the entire affair had been orchestrated from the beginning. Sir Bartholomew was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a face weathered by decades of rural justice and eyes that seemed to see through pretense as easily as glass. When he arrived at Ashworth Hall, he treated everyone with the same measured courtesy, asking his questions in a calm, unhurried manner that belied the razor sharpness of his intellect. He interviewed me first, in the small sitting room where Lady Venetia had made her accusations. His questions were direct but not unkind, probing the timeline of events, my relationship with the Duke, my access to Lady Venetia's chambers. I answered as honestly as I could, though my voice trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. "You are certain that you never entered Lady Venetia's rooms?" he asked. "I am certain," I replied. "I have no duties that would take me there, and I would have no reason to go." "And you have never seen these items before?" He gestured toward the jewelry, still laid out on the table as evidence. "Never, Your Honor. Before Lady Venetia accused me, I had not even known of their existence." He nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away, and moved on to his next question. The servants who claimed to have found the jewelry confessed under questioning that they had been instructed to plant it by Lady Venetia herself. One of them, a young footman named Thomas Ainsley, broke down in tears when confronted with inconsistencies in his story. "She said it was for the good of the family," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said the Duke had been bewitched by the kitchen maid, and that someone had to save him from himself. I did not want to do it, Your Honor. I swear I did not want to. But she threatened to have me dismissed without a reference if I refused. The jewelry in question was identified as pieces that Lady Venetia had brought with her from London, items that had never been reported missing because they had never been stolen. The entire accusation was a fabrication, a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent woman for crimes she did not commit. Lady Venetia was publicly exposed. When Sir Bartholomew delivered his findings, in a report that spared no detail of Lady Venetia's machinations, the effect was immediate and devastating. Her carefully cultivated reputation, maintained over 6 decades of social maneuvering, collapsed like a house of cards. The families she had dominated, the rivals she had destroyed, the countless victims of her schemes, all found in her exposure a kind of poetic justice. I was not present for the confrontation that followed, but Hadrian told me about it afterward, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Lady Venetia had attempted to justify her actions, claiming that she had been protecting the family name from a fortune-hunting servant who had seduced her nephew. But Hadrian had refused to listen. He had informed her, in terms that left no room for ambiguity, that she was no longer welcome at Ashworth Hall, that her interference in his life was at an end, and that if she ever attempted to harm me again, he would see her ruined as thoroughly as she had tried to ruin me. She departed the next morning, her carriage leaving tracks in the fresh snow as it carried her away from the estate. I watched from the window of the library, Hadrian's arm around my waist, and felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost physical. But with the departure of Lady Venetia came a new challenge, one that Hadrian had been anticipating, but that still filled me with trepidation. The scandal of his great-aunt's disgrace would spread through society within days, and with it would come the revelation of his attachment to me, the kitchen maid who had somehow captured the heart of one of England's most eligible dukes. The gossip would be relentless, the judgment would be harsh. And I, who had spent my entire life avoiding notice, would suddenly find myself at the center of a storm I was ill-equipped to weather. Hadrian, sensing my fear, took both my hands in his and looked into my eyes with an intensity that made everything else fade away. "I will not lie to you," he said. "What is coming will not be easy. There will be whispers and stares and invitations that are suddenly withdrawn. There will be people who refuse to receive you, hostesses who decline to include you in their gatherings, ladies who cut you in the street. Society is cruel to those who dare to violate its rules, and what we are doing violates every rule they hold sacred." "I know," I whispered. "I am afraid." "So am I," he admitted. "But I would rather face their scorn together than live another day without you. I have spent 3 years in this house, alone with my books and my bitterness, convincing myself that love was a weakness I could not afford. You showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that love is the only thing worth having, the only thing worth fighting for. And I will fight for you, Elspeth. I will fight for us, until the day I die." He knelt before me then, there in the library where we had first spoken, where he had first kissed me, where my entire life had changed irrevocably and forever. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I must produce heirs, not because society expects it, not because duty demands it. Marry me because I love you, because I cannot imagine waking another morning without seeing your face, because you are the other half of my soul, and I will never be whole without you." The tears were flowing down my cheeks now, but I was smiling through them, smiling so widely that my face hurt. "Yes," I said. "Yes, Hadrian, I will marry you." He rose and swept me into his arms, spinning me around the library in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. When at last he set me down, we were both laughing, giddy with relief and happiness and the knowledge that whatever came next, we would face it together. The wedding took place in the spring. It was not a grand society affair, not the elaborate spectacle that might have accompanied the marriage of the Duke of Ashworth under normal circumstances. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony in the estate's private chapel, attended only by the household servants who had become like family to me and a handful of Hadrian's closest friends who had proven themselves worthy of his trust. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect April blue, the gardens bursting with the first flowers of the season. I woke early, too nervous to sleep, and spent a long time at the window of the small dressing room that had been prepared for me, watching the sun rise over the hills and wondering if I was truly ready for the enormous change that awaited me. Mrs. Blackett arrived shortly after dawn, her eyes suspiciously bright, her manner brisk with suppressed emotion. She had brought with her 2 of the younger maids, Prudence Ellerby and Violet Marsh, who had been assigned to help me dress. They fussed over my hair and my gown with an enthusiasm that might have seemed excessive had I not understood its source. They were happy for me, genuinely happy, and their joy eased something in my heart that I had not even realized was anxious. Mrs. Blackett wept through the entire ceremony, overcome by an emotion that surprised everyone, not least herself. She had been my champion from the beginning, I realized, had seen something in the frightened young woman who arrived at Ashworth Hall all those years ago that she had believed worth nurturing. Her tears were not only joy for my happiness, but pride in her own role in bringing it about. The cook, Mrs. Henrietta Finch, had prepared a wedding breakfast that rivaled anything served in the finest houses in London. There were delicate pastries and fresh fruits, roasted meats and savory pies, cakes and biscuits, and every manner of sweet delicacy. The table in the small dining room was laden with more food than the assembled guests could possibly consume, but Mrs. Finch had insisted on excess. This was a celebration, she declared, and she would not have it said that the Ashworth household had skimped on the Duke's wedding day. And the footmen and maids who had once been my colleagues now served me with a deference that felt strange, but also, somehow, right. I saw in their faces a mixture of awe and affection that touched me deeply. They had known me as one of their own, had worked alongside me and eaten beside me and shared the small triumphs and trials of servant life. Now I was to be their mistress, and yet they did not seem to resent the change. If anything, they seemed proud of it, as though my elevation reflected well on all of them. I wore a gown of ivory silk that Hadrian had commissioned from a London modiste, a creation so beautiful that I had wept when I first tried it on. My hair, usually hidden beneath a servant's cap, was arranged in an elaborate style that revealed its true color, a deep auburn that Hadrian said reminded him of autumn leaves and copper pennies and all the warmth of a fire on a cold night. When I walked down the aisle toward him, when I saw the way he looked at me with such overwhelming love that it seemed to fill the entire chapel, I knew that every hardship I had endured, every lonely night and every cruel word and every moment of doubt, had been leading me to this, to him, to a happiness so complete that it felt like a miracle. I, Hadrian Blackwood, take thee, Elspeth Wren, to be my wedded wife. His voice was steady as he spoke the vows, his eyes never leaving mine. And when it was my turn, I found that the words came easily, as though I had been rehearsing them my entire life. I, Elspeth Wren, take thee, Hadrian Blackwood, to be my wedded husband. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, when Hadrian kissed me with the entire household watching and cheering, I felt something settle into place inside me, some final piece of a puzzle I had been solving since the day I was born. I was no longer Elspeth Wren, the orphaned kitchen maid who had learned to make herself invisible. I was the Duchess of Ashworth, beloved wife of a man who had seen me, truly seen me, and had loved what he saw. The months that followed were a revelation. Hadrian taught me everything I needed to know about managing a great household, and I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for the task. The skills I had developed as a servant, the attention to detail, the ability to anticipate needs, the capacity for hard work, served me well in my new role. The household staff, who had known me as one of their own, transferred their loyalty to me with a readiness that warmed my heart. I continued my education under Hadrian's patient tutelage, devouring books with a hunger that seemed insatiable. I read histories and novels, poetry and philosophy, the works of great thinkers, and the simple pleasures of popular fiction. My world, which had once been so small, expanded with every page I turned, until I felt that I could hold entire universes inside my mind. Society, as Hadrian had predicted, was less welcoming. The scandal of our marriage spread through London like wildfire, and the invitations that arrived at Ashworth Hall dwindled to a trickle. We were discussed in drawing rooms and gossiped about at balls, our story twisted and distorted until it bore little resemblance to the truth. Some claimed that I had bewitched the Duke with some form of dark magic. Others suggested that I had blackmailed him with knowledge of unspeakable sins. And a few, the cruelest few, speculated that I was nothing more than a common prostitute who had somehow convinced a naive nobleman to make an honest woman of her. The first time I encountered such gossip directly, at a rare social engagement we had ventured to attend, I was devastated. A group of ladies had been whispering behind their fans as I passed, their voices just loud enough for me to catch fragments of their conversation. "The Duke's kitchen wench," one of them said, and another laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the pleasant hum of the gathering. I retreated to a quiet corner, fighting back tears, cursing myself for ever believing I could belong in this world. But Hadrian found me there within moments, as though some invisible thread connected us and allowed him to sense my distress. "What did they say?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It does not matter," I told him, shaking my head. "They said what everyone is saying, what everyone will always say." He took my hands in his and looked into my eyes with an intensity that made everything else fade away. "Then we will give them something new to talk about," he said. "We will be so happy, so obviously, conspicuously, undeniably in love, that their gossip will turn to ash in their mouths. They will watch us and wonder how they ever settled for the pale imitations of marriage that pass for success in their world." I managed a watery smile. "And if that does not work, then we will retreat to Ashworth Hall and forget they exist," he replied with a shrug. "I never cared much for London society anyway. Too many people with too little to occupy their minds." But Hadrian and I faced the gossip together, and somehow that made it bearable. We hosted small gatherings at Ashworth Hall, inviting those few friends who had stood by us during the scandal. We traveled to the continent, exploring Paris and Rome and Vienna, cities that cared little for the rigid hierarchies of English society. Our time abroad was a revelation. In Paris, we walked along the Seine at sunset, watching the light dance on the water and the lovers stroll arm in arm along the banks. In Rome, we explored ancient ruins and stood in awe before the magnificence of the Sistine Chapel, our hands clasped together as we gazed up at Michelangelo's masterpiece. In Vienna, we attended the opera and danced at balls where no one knew our history, where we were simply a wealthy English couple enjoying the pleasures of travel. It was in Venice, on a gondola gliding through the moonlit canals, that Hadrian first spoke of his dreams for our future. "I want to give you everything," he said, his arm around my shoulders, the lights of the city reflected in his gray eyes. "I want to show you the world, every beautiful corner of it. I want to spend the rest of my life making up for all the years you spent in darkness and hardship. You owe me nothing," I told him. "You have already given me more than I ever dreamed of." "Then consider it pure selfishness," he replied with a smile. "I find that I am happier when you are happy. It is entirely self-serving." I laughed, leaning into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. "If this is selfishness," I said, "then I hope you never become generous." And we built a life together, a life filled with books and conversation and laughter, and a love so deep that it seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. It was during a quiet evening in the library, nearly a year after our wedding, that Hadrian raised the subject I had been carefully avoiding. "The family name requires an heir," he said gently, taking my hand in his. "I have never cared about such things, as you know. But there are practical considerations, the estate, the title, the responsibilities that come with both." "I know," I said, and I squeezed his hand tightly. "I have been thinking about it as well, and—" I looked into his gray eyes, those eyes that had first seen me as a person rather than a shadow, and felt my heart swell with emotion. "I would like to have children," I admitted, "not for the sake of the title or the estate, but for ourselves. I have spent my entire life alone, Hadrian. The thought of creating a family, of watching our children grow and learn and become who they are meant to be, it fills me with a joy I cannot fully express." He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "Then we shall have children," he said, "as many as you wish, and I shall love each and every one of them as fiercely as I love their mother." The thought of a future filled with children and grandchildren, with family gatherings and holiday celebrations, with a legacy of love rather than scandal, made my eyes fill with tears of happiness. "I love you," I whispered. "I love you more than I ever knew it was possible to love anyone." "And I love you," he replied, pulling me into his arms. "My Elspeth, my Duchess, my everything." Outside the library windows, the stars were beginning to emerge. pinpricks of light against the velvet darkness of the evening sky. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the shelves of books that had first brought us together. And I, who had once believed herself to be nothing, realized that I had become something extraordinary. I had become loved. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Society's memory is long, and there were those who never forgave me for daring to rise above my station. Lady Venetia, from her exile in a distant county, continued to spread malicious gossip about me whenever the opportunity arose. And the transition from servant to duchess required constant vigilance, constant learning, constant adaptation to a world that had once seemed as foreign as the moon. But for every challenge, there was a corresponding joy. The birth of our first child, a daughter we named Marjorie after my mother, filled Ashworth Hall with a new kind of light. She had Hadrian's gray eyes and my auburn hair, and from the moment she took her first breath, she was the center of our universe. I remember the night she was born, the longest night of my life, and also the most profound. The labor was difficult, the hours stretching endlessly as the midwife worked, and Hadrian paced the corridor outside my chamber, unable to rest, unable to eat, unable to think of anything but my safety. When at last the ordeal was over and the midwife placed our daughter in my arms, I felt a love so overwhelming that it seemed impossible my heart could contain it. Hadrian came to me then, his face pale with exhaustion and relief, his eyes bright with tears he did not try to hide. He knelt beside the bed and looked at our daughter with an expression of such wonder that it made me weep. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She is absolutely perfect." "She has your eyes," I told him, touching the soft curve of her cheek with a finger that trembled with emotion. "She will be stubborn and brilliant and kind, just like her father." He laughed, that warm, genuine laugh that I had worked so hard to coax from him in the early days of our acquaintance. "And she will be brave and resilient and beautiful, just like her mother," he replied. We named her Marjorie, after the mother I had lost so long ago, the woman who had loved me fiercely and sacrificed everything for my well-being. I like to think that somewhere, in whatever heaven awaited good and loving souls, my mother was watching over her namesake with pride. Our son followed 2 years later, a serious, thoughtful young man named Edmund, after Hadrian's long-lost brother, who seemed destined to inherit his father's love of books and learning. Where Marjorie was vivacious and adventurous, always running through the gardens or climbing trees she had been expressly forbidden to approach, Edmund was contemplative and careful, more likely to be found in the library with a book than anywhere else in the estate. Hadrian delighted in both of them equally, finding in fatherhood a purpose and joy that his earlier life had denied him. He taught them to ride and to fish, to appreciate poetry, and to argue philosophy. He listened to their childish problems with the same gravity he would have given to matters of state, and he made them feel always that they were the most important people in his world. Watching him with our children, seeing the way he had transformed from the cold, isolated man I had first encountered into this warm, devoted father, I often found myself overwhelmed with gratitude. This was the life I had never dared to dream of, the family I had never imagined I would have. And every day, in 1,000 small ways, I gave thanks for the storm that had brought me to his library, for the spilled wine and the ruined papers, for the moment when he had looked at me and truly seen me for the first time. As our children grew, so too did my confidence in my new role. I discovered that I had a talent for charity work, for organizing aid to the poor families in the surrounding villages who reminded me all too keenly of my own difficult past. I established a school for orphaned girls, a refuge where they could learn to read and write and dream of futures beyond domestic service. The school became my passion, my purpose beyond motherhood and marriage. I spent hours each week visiting the students, listening to their stories, helping them navigate the challenges they faced. Many of them reminded me of myself at that age, frightened and alone, believing themselves destined for lives of servitude and obscurity. I tried to show them, through my own example, that such destinies could be rewritten. I called the school the Marjorie Wren Academy in honor of my mother, and I endowed it with enough funds to ensure its continuation for generations to come. The girls who graduated from its halls went on to become teachers, nurses, governesses, even wives of respectable tradesmen. Some of them kept in touch with me over the years, sending letters that told of their successes and their struggles, their joys and their sorrows. Each letter was a reminder that my own transformation was not an isolated miracle, but a possibility open to anyone with the courage to pursue it. And I became, in my own small way, a voice for those who had no voice, a living example of what was possible when love and determination combined to overcome the barriers of class and convention. The villagers who had once viewed me with suspicion, wondering what sort of woman could bewitch a duke into marriage, gradually came to respect and even admire me. They saw my work at the school, my genuine concern for their well-being, my refusal to put on airs or pretend to be something I was not. And slowly, over years of consistent effort, the initial hostility thawed into acceptance and eventually into warmth. Mrs. Blackett, who remained at Ashworth Hall long after she might reasonably have retired, often remarked on the change. "You have done more good for this community in 10 years," she told me once, "than the previous 3 generations of Blackwoods combined. They built monuments to themselves. You build futures for others." Her words touched me deeply, but I could not claim sole credit for the transformation. Hadrian had supported every initiative, had provided the funds and the political influence necessary to overcome obstacles, had encouraged me when I doubted myself, and celebrated with me when I succeeded. Whatever good I had accomplished was as much his achievement as mine. Hadrian, for his part, emerged from the shell of bitterness and isolation that had encased him for so long. He laughed more easily now, smiled more readily, engaged with the world in ways that would have been unthinkable in the dark years after Rosalind's death. Our friends, those loyal few who had stood by us through the scandal, marveled at the transformation. The cold, remote Duke of Ashworth had become a devoted husband and father, a generous landlord, a pillar of the community in ways that his ancestors would never have imagined. But perhaps the greatest change was in my own heart. I had spent so many years believing myself to be worthless, convincing myself that I deserved no better than shadows and servitude, that it took a long time to fully accept the miracle of my new life. There were nights when I woke from troubled dreams, certain that it had all been a fantasy, that I would open my eyes to find myself back in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, alone and forgotten. But then I would feel Hadrian's arm around me, hear the soft sound of his breathing, see the moonlight falling across his beloved face, and the fear would fade. I was not dreaming. This was real. This was mine. As I sit here now, in the library where everything began, watching the fire burn low in the grate and listening to the distant sounds of my family settling in for the night, I find myself reflecting on the strange and wondrous path that has led me to this moment. I think of the frightened young woman I once was, the ghost who haunted the corridors of this great house, believing herself invisible. I think of the storm that brought me to Hadrian's library, the spilled wine and the ruined papers, and the moment when he looked at me and truly saw me for the first time. I think of Lady Venetia's cruelty and the investigation that followed, of the revelation about my parents and the wedding that defied convention, of the children who have filled this house with laughter and love. I think of the gossip and the scorn, the whispers and the judgment, the 1,000 small battles I have fought to prove my worth. And I think of Hadrian, always Hadrian, the man who taught me to read and to love and to believe that I deserved happiness. "I have never been kissed," I whispered to him on that fateful night, a confession that contained within it all my loneliness and longing. And he smiled, that beautiful, devastating smile, and offered to teach me. What he taught me was so much more than the mechanics of a kiss. He taught me that love is not a weakness, but a strength, that vulnerability is not failure, but courage, that the walls we build to protect ourselves can also become the prisons that trap us. He taught me that class and convention are poor substitutes for genuine human connection, that a library full of books is no comfort without someone to share them, that a title and a fortune mean nothing if the heart is empty. He taught me that I was worthy of love, of respect, of a future filled with possibility rather than limitation. And in teaching me, he saved himself as well. The candles are burning low now, and soon Mrs. Blackett, who has grown old and gray in the service of this house, but refuses to retire because she claims she would not know what to do with herself, will come to remind me that the hour is late and I should be in bed. Hadrian is already upstairs, reading by lamplight, waiting for me to join him, as he has waited every night for the past 10 years. Our daughter is asleep in her room, dreaming dreams I can only imagine, while our son studies late, poring over texts in preparation for his eventual entrance to Oxford. This is my life now. This is the life I never dared to dream of, the life that was given to me by a man who saw past my rough hands and servant's clothing to the woman I was capable of becoming. I am the Duchess of Ashworth, wife and mother, reader and philanthropist, once a kitchen maid and now the mistress of this great estate. But more than any title, more than any position, I am Elspeth. I am loved, and that in the end is the only thing that ever truly mattered. As I rise from my chair and prepare to join my husband upstairs, I pause for a moment at the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds of Ashworth Hall. The trees are silhouetted against the night sky, their branches swaying gently in a breeze I cannot feel. Somewhere in the distance an owl calls, its lonely cry echoing across the darkness. And I think, not for the first time, of how far I have come from the frightened orphan who arrived at these gates with nothing but a faded letter and a desperate hope for survival. The journey was not easy. The obstacles were many. But I am here now, standing in the light rather than hiding in the shadows, and I know with absolute certainty that I would not change a single moment of it. Even the pain, even the loneliness, even the years of invisibility led me, in the end, to this, to him, to home. I climb the stairs slowly, my hand trailing along the polished banister, savoring the quiet of the house at night. When I reach our chambers and push open the door, Hadrian looks up from his book with a smile that still makes my heart flutter, even after all these years. "There you are," he says, setting aside the volume and extending his hand toward me. "I was beginning to think you had fallen asleep in the library again. I was remembering," I tell him as I cross the room and take his hand, "the night we first met, the storm, the spilled wine." His smile softens into something more tender, more knowing. "The night that changed everything," he says. Yes, I agree, sinking onto the bed beside him and letting him pull me into his embrace. The night that changed everything. We lie there together in the lamplight, his arms around me, my head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Outside the window, the moon rises higher in the sky, casting silver light across the world, and I feel a peace so profound that it seems to emanate from the very center of my being. "I have never been kissed," I whispered all those years ago, a confession born of innocence and longing. "Then let me teach you," he replied, and in doing so, he taught me everything. This is my story. This is our story, a tale of love and betrayal, of class and convention, of a servant girl who dared to dream and a duke who dared to love her. It is not the story that society expected for either of us, not the narrative that our families or our positions would have predicted. But it is true. Every word of it, written in the lines of our faces and the gray streaks in our hair and the children who carry our legacy into a future we can only imagine. And if you take nothing else from this tale, take this. You are not what the world tells you that you are. You are not defined by your birth or your station or the circumstances that shaped your early years. You are capable of transformation, of growth.